This video will deal with organising, comping and producing a draft mix for your multi-track recording, although a lot of the theory and techniques discussed here can be used for other pieces of coursework. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that your project is clearly organised and parts are clearly labelled. Now what you can do with individual tracks, because they may not have the same name as the track names, is you can right click on a chunk of audio region, you can go to name and colour, and you can name regions by tracks, and that will change the name of the region to the track name. You may also wish to change icons. You can do that by clicking on the instrument name, and then you've got different icons for different types of instruments. Before producing a draft mix then, once your project is organised, you're going to need to do any comping. So completing, essentially, audio files or audio regions that are an amalgamation of perhaps two or more parts. Now in this case, there happens to be an error in this guitar part here. So let's just listen to that in isolation. And what I can do is by clicking on this drop down arrow here, I can open up the comping view, and if I left click once on this region, we can now play this particular take. So I'm happy with that. So what I can do now is I can close that by clicking on the drop down arrow, and it will now play that first take rather than the second. Now another thing that you might have to do is you might have to swipe between two takes, and the way you do that is you left click and hold on a particular region, and you swipe from left to right, and that will select whichever part of whichever take you drag and select. Now if you're happy with your comping selection point, you can then close your audio region and you can listen and you can make sure that it sounds as you want it to. The thing to note though is when you do swipe between takes is to ensure that you haven't crossed or you haven't swiped where there is what's called a zero crossing point. Now what you'll see is that if you zoom in closely enough, audio files will become or start to look like waveforms. So if I zoom in a little closer here, there you can see the waveforms. Now where this has been swiped, you can see with the two audio takes that there is no audio occurring in those gaps. And just to be doubly sure of that, what I will do is I will move along slightly, a little more. Just to make sure that I haven't So then when you've got your comping point selected and you're happy with it, you can zoom back out and you can listen to it to make sure that there's no clicking. Now if it sounds like there's an audible click or gap in the audio, you'll need to go back and you'll need to make sure that your comping point is accurate. Now in this instance I was happy with the first take rather than the second, so I'm going to select the whole of the first take. And I'm going to close that. Now when you are happy with that, you can select this drop down arrow over here, and if you're merging two audio files, so two takes, you'd need to select flatten and merge. So in this case we'll do that, and that will create a merged audio file that will then decrease the amount of audio that's held and stored within your project, so it's less for the computer to remember and to do. Now you'd need to do the same for any other parts that you have comped, and I happen to know that there's a problem with the kick drum with these takes here. That kick drum in the first bar is slightly out of time. Now, if you try to comp one track when you've recorded, say for instance, an instrument using 4 microphones, you may end up selecting different parts from different recordings, and then you may end up with phasing, which is where the audio recorded of different microphones doesn't quite line up with each other. So what we need to do when you're comping, say for example, a drum kit or a guitar part that's been recorded with 3 microphones, is you need to group those particular parts. So what you do is you select the tracks in the mixer view, click on the dark grey space here, and you put them into a group. You then need to select editing selection with phase locked audio. Now what will happen is that when you make one change to, say for example, the kick drum track, it will make a change to the other tracks. So what we need to do here is to select the first part of the first take, and then have a little listen, and you'll see that that same edit point has been put into those other parts there, and that is really, really important. And now we've got a drum kit part that's sounding accurate and has been comped properly with a grouped selection of drums. Now, when you have done that, to save any confusion or worry when you're mixing, you can then remove the groups, and then that same editing will exist, but then you have more control over individual volumes of individual parts of the drum kit. So what we'll do now is we'll quickly flatten and merge these other parts. So you now have a multi-track recording where all parts have been flattened and merged, or comped and organised. What you'll then need to do is move on to making a draft mix. So open your mixer view and immediately select all tracks and reduce their volumes to -10. And the reason we do this is this is what's called headroom, and it will allow for the addition of EQ and compression, which will eventually increase the volume of tracks. Otherwise, if you don't have this headroom, then you will clip on your output, and you'll probably find that when you reduce the overall volume of all parts, the output volume will still remain fairly high. Now the thing that we immediately notice is that the recording sounds a bit muddy. There's not a lot of clarity with different parts, and there are a few things that we can do to remedy this just by controlling volume and panning. Now the vocal is going to be perhaps the most important part of this. So the vocal is going to stay on -10, but other parts may well be reduced. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to listen to just the vocal and the drums. Here lies a city on fire, singing along the arsonist's choir. Now in this case, the drum kit sounds a little bit too far back, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the volume of the drum kit just to bring it further forward in the mix. Now here I go. When I'm happy with the volume of my drum kit and my vocal together, now that I've got the front and the back, I can start to add other parts. So let's add the bass. Here lies a city on fire, singing along the arsonist's choir. Now you can see visually that the decibel level of the bass is far quieter than the drum kit and also the vocal. Now at this stage, that's not a bad thing because the bass part will be made up of several low frequencies which we may need to control later when we use EQ. I'm now going to add in the lead guitar part.
Here lies a city on fire, singing along the arsonist's choir. Now here I go.
So that part there needs to be fairly ambient, so I've reduced the volume very significantly. I'm then going to add in the first rhythm guitar part.
Here lies a city on fire, singing along the arsonist's choir. Now here I go. It started with a spark.
And I'm going to add in the second rhythm guitar part, which is a little bit more distorted.
It started with a spark and burned into the dark.
Now visually, you may notice that the guitar parts are quite significantly quieter than your drums and your bass, and the main reason for that actually is because there are more of them, so therefore their frequencies sum together and they sound louder. So when you've created a draft mix using volume, you can then start to use panning to give you a bit more control over the placement of instruments in the stereo field. Now we're going to want to keep instruments like kick and bass in the centre because they're responsible for grounding the mix because they are made up of and include low frequencies. Other parts then, we have a little bit more freedom with which to use panning. Now the vocal is quite important, so we're going to keep that in the centre as well because it's the main focus of the song. The lead guitar is an addition to that, so we're going to put that to one side, so you could bring that either slightly left or slightly right, and that would help it to stand out in that particular area of the stereo field. For the rhythm guitars, we could bring these to the right and to the left to widen the stereo image. And with the distorted or heavily distorted guitars, we can bring those a lot wider because they're a little louder. And at this point we want the song to sound a bit bigger and fuller because it's building up. Other parts that you might like to pan are your drum kit. So where you have an overhead left, pan it slightly to the left, so -10, and overhead right +10. And the reason for that is that if you think about it visually, the drum kit will take up the segment in front of you. It would not take up a full 180 degrees, so you wouldn't pan to the extreme. You may also choose to pan your snare drum slightly to the left or the right, depending on which way round the drummer was playing, whether they were left-handed or right-handed. But in most cases, if they're right-handed and you're listening as the audience to the recording, the snare drum will be panned to the right by 5. So listening to that now, it should give each of those parts a little bit more of a specific placement.
Here lies a city on fire, singing along the arsonist's choir. Now here I go.
You will also notice that as you pan instruments to the left and the right, it may decrease their volume. And this is actually the way that Logic works with panning, is it's not exactly the same as a panning pot on a mixing desk. It simulates panning by reducing the volume of a particular part on the opposite side of the stereo field. So when you do pan parts, you may find that they get quieter, so just be aware of that. So there, then, you've made use of volume and panning to produce a draft mix. The next video will deal with application of EQ. Thank you for watching.